1970. This isn't some gritty Vietnam realism project that you'd expect from Scorsese's criteria. Instead, it's a straight-up 3-hour spectacle that reconstructs the entire Pearl Harbor attack from both the Japanese and American perspectives simultaneously. The audacity alone is insane. Director Richard Fleischer and Japanese director Kinji Fukasaku split responsibility, which sounds like a nightmare in theory, but somehow creates this perfect balance where you actually understand the tactical brilliance on both sides instead of just watching explosions. The thing that makes Scorsese respect this film is the sheer ambition. They built full-scale replicas of battleships, coordinated with the actual US Navy, and shot with a budget that would bankrupt most productions today. Zero miniatures, zero fakery. You're watching real planes, real explosions, real chaos. The film pulls off something almost impossible. It makes a historical event that everyone already knows the ending to feel genuinely suspenseful. Watching Japanese pilots who genuinely believed their attack would cripple America for good, then cutting to American sailors who had no idea what was coming, creates this sick tension. George C. Scott brings this gravitas to the American side, while the Japanese sequences got proper dramatic weight too. Critics initially called it bloated. It was 3 hours of pure filmmaking spectacle during a time when audiences were exhausted by war. But box office numbers don't lie. It became one of the biggest films of 1970. Scorsese's take? Spectacle with substance is cinema at its finest. Number 9. Patton, 1970. George C. Scott is magnetic, terrifying, brilliant, and completely unhinged as General George S. Patton, and the opening monologue in front of an enormous American flag is quite possibly the greatest piece of acting cinema has ever captured. You could argue the entire film peaks in those first 5 minutes. Director Franklin J. Schaffner doesn't rely on big battle sequences to sell this story. Instead, it's all about watching a man obsessed with war, reincarnation, and his own legacy slowly come apart as the war winds down and bureaucracy starts closing in on him. The film covers his rise in North Africa, his dominance in Europe, and then his spectacular fall from grace when his mouth gets him relieved of command. Carl Malden plays a superior officer who genuinely cares about Patton but can't let him keep embarrassing the military with his wild speeches and controversial statements. What's remarkable is how Scott portrays Patton as both a military genius and a genuinely damaged person. He's homophobic, racist by modern standards, and completely unstable. Yet the film never asks you to excuse these things. It just shows them. Patton absolutely dominated the 1970 Academy Awards, winning Best Picture, Best Actor for Scott, Best Director, Best Original Screenplay, and 3 others. The film earned over $80 million adjusted for inflation. Critics called Scott's performance the best they'd seen in years. Scorsese respected Patton because it understood that great men are often terrible people, and you don't need to sand down the edges to tell a powerful story. Number 8. Mas. H. 1970. Robert Altman cracked some kind of code here. He made a Korean War film that's simultaneously hilarious, devastating, and deeply anti-war without ever feeling preachy about it. The title stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and the film follows a group of doctors and nurses running a hospital just behind the front lines. Instead of focusing on combat, Altman does something revolutionary. He ignores the war entirely and shows you what actually breaks soldiers. Boredom, dark humor, substance abuse, and the knowledge that everything they're trying to do is completely pointless. Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, and Tom Skerritt play surgeons who've developed an almost manic sense of humor to cope with the endless stream of mangled bodies coming through their operating tent. They stage elaborate pranks, run a betting pool, and generally act like they're having a party while surrounded by human suffering. The genius is that Altman filmed it like a documentary, with overlapping dialogue, characters drifting in and out of frame, and a loose structure that feels like watching real people instead of movie characters. The film was controversial as hell when it came out. Some critics called it disrespectful to actual war veterans. Others recognized it as the most honest anti-war statement Hollywood had ever made. Mas H went on to win the Palme d'Or at Cannes and spawn one of the greatest television series ever made. Scorsese's perspective? This is how you tell hard truths about conflict. Humor is the only sane response to insanity. Number 7. Kelly's Heroes, 1970. This one's a wild card. It's a World War II heist film. Yes, you read that correctly. James Caan, Telly Savalas, and an absolutely charismatic Carol O'Connor lead a team of American soldiers who go rogue to steal millions in Nazi gold. The film is directed by Brian G. Hutton and shot with this glossy, almost comedic tone that shouldn't work at all, but somehow does. Clint Eastwood shows up as a laid-back guitar-playing sergeant who's basically just trying to stay alive and make some money. The action sequences are genuinely brilliant. There's a tank battle, multiple ambushes, and a chase sequence that's legitimately thrilling. What separates Kelly's heroes from standard war movies is that nobody here is fighting for patriotism or honor. They're fighting because their commanding officer got killed and they decided to grab some gold before heading home. It's mercenary, cynical, and weirdly honest about what war actually does to people's sense of morality. The film has this incredible energy. Carroll O'Connor plays a general who's so obsessed with the gold that he loses sight of everything else, and it's this perfect commentary on greed consuming everyone, soldier and officer alike. The movie earned over $40 million, making it one of 1970's biggest hits, but it never got the respect it deserved because critics thought it was too light for a war film. Scorsese loved this precisely because it refused to genuflect at the altar of war. Sometimes the truest anti-war statement is just showing how ridiculous everything becomes. Number 6. Catch-22, 1970. Mike Nichols directed this unhinged adaptation of Joseph Heller's equally unhinged novel about World War II bombing pilots who are losing their minds. The film is chaotic, nonsensical, and deliberately impossible to follow in a traditional narrative sense. Alan Arkin plays Yossarian, a bombardier who realizes that everybody around him is absolutely insane, and that the military has structured itself specifically to punish anyone sane enough to recognize how insane everything is. That's the whole catch-22. To get grounded from flying dangerous bombing runs, you have to be declared insane. But if you ask to be grounded because you're scared of dying, that proves you're sane, so you have to keep flying. It's circular, nightmarish logic, and the film doesn't try to make sense of it. It just lets it wash over you. The cast is stacked with early 1970s talent. Jon Voight, Orson Welles, Buck Henry, and a bunch of future stars all playing military officers and enlisted men who keep spouting contradictory orders and policies. The film deliberately confuses sequences, uses absurdist humor, and creates an atmosphere that's part bureaucratic nightmare and part dark comedy. It was financially successful but critically divisive. Some called it unmakeable to adapt a novel this complex. Others recognized it as one of the first true anti-war films to abandon all pretense of telling a coherent story because war itself isn't coherent. Scorsese sees this film as fearless. It refuses to play by the rules of traditional cinema because traditional cinema can't properly explain the complete madness of modern warfare. Number 5. The Poseidon Adventure, 1972. Wait, hear me out. This is technically a disaster film, not a war movie, but Scorsese actually mentioned it in context of 1970s filmmaking because it captures something essential about how cinema shifted during this era. A luxury ocean liner gets flipped upside down by a massive tidal wave, and the film follows a group of survivors trying to escape the overturned ship. Ernest Borgnine, Shelley Winters, and Gene Hackman lead the cast through this increasingly desperate journey. What makes this relevant to war cinema is that it's basically a war movie transposed to a maritime setting. There's a clear mission, constant danger, group dynamics falling apart under pressure, and people making increasingly poor decisions because they're terrified. The disaster becomes a substitute for war. The ocean liner becomes a combat zone. The lack of food becomes the lack of supplies. Director Ronald Neame understood this parallel and played it brutally. People die constantly, often unexpectedly. Shelley Winters' performance is especially devastating because she's this older woman who gives everything she has just to save younger people, and her body literally gives out. The film won an Academy Award and earned over $90 million adjusted for inflation. But beyond numbers, what Scorsese respected was the willingness to use spectacle not for spectacle's sake, but to tell stories about human failure under impossible circumstances. The Poseidon Adventure proved you didn't need actual war to explore themes of survival and sacrifice. Number 4. A Bridge Too Far, 1977. This is the ultimate ensemble war epic. Richard Attenborough directed this massive, star-studded adaptation of the Operation Market Garden disaster in 1944. Sean Connery, Michael Caine, Robert Redford, Laurence Olivier, James Caan, and like 20 other A-list actors all show up for what amounts to a 3-hour military failure. The film doesn't glorify anything. It meticulously explains the operation, the personalities involved, the political motivations, and then shows you step by step how everything falls apart. The budget was enormous, the set pieces are genuine spectacles, and the entire approach to the material is deadly serious. Attenborough, who was an actor before becoming a director, understood how to use star power to make you care about individual characters while also grasping the massive scale of what's happening. The film works on multiple levels. You get close character moments with people like Ryan O'Neal and Robert Redford, but you also see the big-picture strategic failure that costs thousands of lives. The final hour is pure disaster. Watching trained soldiers realize they're about to get slaughtered and having to accept it because the operation has gone too far to reverse. The film didn't make huge money initially because audiences were tired of war films by 1977, but it found respect from critics and historians who recognized it as one of the most accurate and unsparing depictions of World War II ever filmed. Scorsese's take is that this film proves spectacle can serve truth. You don't sacrifice realism just because you've got huge production values. Number 3. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Francis Ford Coppola made a film about the Vietnam War that transcends the Vietnam War entirely. The story follows an army captain going upriver into Cambodia to find and kill a renegade special forces colonel who's become a god to his men. The film is technically a war movie, but it's really a descent into madness, a meditation on power, imperialism, and the corruption of the soul. The production was absolutely catastrophic. Marlon Brando showed up massively overweight and improvised most of his dialogue while barely appearing on screen. Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack during filming. The set flooded. The schedule ballooned from 5 months to over a year. By the time Coppola finished editing, he'd spent somewhere north of $40 million, an unthinkable amount in 1979. The final film is hypnotic. The famous napalm sequences, the Do Long Bridge attack, the final confrontation with Kurtz in a compound that looks like it belongs in a fever dream. Coppola used real helicopters, real explosions, and real danger. Actors genuinely didn't know what was happening because Coppola encouraged on-set chaos. The film won the Palme d'Or and 2 Academy Awards. It made money, lots of it, earning over $90 million adjusted for inflation. Critics called it either a masterpiece or a disaster depending on who was writing. Scorsese sees this as the film that changed everything. It proved that cinema could be genuinely dangerous, that ambition without restraint could actually produce something transcendent. Apocalypse Now isn't a war film about Vietnam. It's a war film about the human capacity for corruption and the seduction of power. Number 2. The Deer Hunter, 1978. Michael Cimino made his directorial debut with this absolutely brutal Vietnam War film that follows 3 working-class steelworkers from Pennsylvania as they're drafted, go to Vietnam, get captured, experience unspeakable horror, and come home traumatized forever. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage basically give career-defining performances as men whose friendship is slowly destroyed by war. The film opens with this long, almost boring wedding sequence in their hometown. Cimino takes his time establishing these characters as real people with real lives and real relationships. Then they go to war, and everything shatters. The most controversial sequence involves Russian roulette, where prisoners are forced to play this absolutely insane game where they might blow their own brains out just for entertainment. The scene is devastating, traumatizing, and absolutely necessary because it shows the complete dehumanization that war creates. When they get home, they're not the same people. De Niro tries to adjust and mostly fails. Walken is completely lost, eventually becoming addicted to drugs and gambling. Savage is so damaged that he's partially paralyzed. The film ends with them at a funeral, playing a Russian folk song, and there's this sense that they'll never fully come home because home no longer exists for them. The Deer Hunter won the Academy Award for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Walken, and 3 others. It earned over $48 million adjusted for inflation. Some Vietnam vets criticized it for historical inaccuracy. Others said it was the most honest Vietnam film ever made. Scorsese respected this because it understands that the real trauma of war isn't the combat, it's what war does to your capacity to function in normal society afterward. Number 1, Come and See, 1985. We're technically moving into the 1980s here, but Scorsese specifically mentions this film when talking about 1970s war cinema influence because it's the spiritual successor to everything those films were building toward. Elem Klimov made a film about the Nazi occupation of Belarus through the eyes of a 14-year-old boy who joins Soviet partisans. This isn't a film you enjoy. This is a film that damages you. The young actor, Alexei Kravchenko, gives a performance so emotionally real that you'll never fully recover from it. We watch his face transform from hopeful teenage patriotism into dead-eyed trauma as he witnesses massacre after massacre. The cinematography is this sickly, oversaturated color that makes everything look diseased. The sound design is this constant bombardment of destruction that never lets you feel safe or calm. There are sequences where entire villages are burned, where civilians are executed, where the camera simply refuses to look away. The film doesn't use music to manipulate your emotions. Instead, it assaults you with diegetic sound, heavy silence, and the physical reality of violence. It's maybe the most powerful anti-war film ever made because it abandons all pretense of entertainment. You're not watching a story, you're witnessing testimony. The film premiered in 1985, but had almost no Western distribution because Soviet authorities had concerns about the depiction of Russian forces. It's been steadily gaining respect over the years as film critics and historians rediscover it. Scorsese calls it the greatest war film ever made because it doesn't try to be cinema in the traditional sense. It just tries to transmit trauma and make you understand the absolute horror of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. So there you have it. 10 films that Scorsese says still absolutely hold up from the most turbulent decade for war cinema in history. The 1970s gave us uncompromising visions from directors who weren't afraid to show us that war is chaos, that heroism is complicated, and that coming home might be worse than dying. Now here's the real question that's going to blow up your comment section. Are these gritty, morally ambiguous 1970s war films better than the superhero blockbusters and military propaganda pieces we get today? Or do modern audiences actually need clearer heroes and villains to feel invested? Drop your takes below and subscribe for more deep dives into cinema history that nobody asked for but everybody secretly wants.